Settle in with a cup of tea and your imagination. This is Detective Duo, where every clue finds its place, just as Tommy and Tuppence would have insisted. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where in the world you're joining from. It was one of those early autumn afternoons when the air felt crisp enough to promise change, yet the sun lingered just long enough to flatter the hedgerows into gold. The laurels, perched on the edge of the sleepy village of Sutton Lee, glowed with domestic contentment. Smoke rose from its squat brick chimneys in two lazy plumes, and the faint scent of applewood drifted through the open parlour windows. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked with the unhurried assurance of a household at ease. Tuppence Beresford, her fair hair perfectly set, and her cardigan the soft blue of late hydrangeas, presided over the tea-table with something of a general marshalling her troops. The silver gleamed, the sandwiches were symmetrical, and the currant scones would have met even Aunt Prudence's formidable standards. Her husband Tommy sat by the window with the air of a man resigned to the prospect of multiple helpings. He held a copy of the Times, but hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. "Tommy," Tuppence said, with the warning note that meant she was half a breath from mischief, "if you're going to sulk through tea, at least pretend to enjoy the peace before Mrs. Calthorpe arrives." Tommy looked up over the edge of the paper. "Peace, my dear girl, is a relative concept. You invite Mrs. Calthorpe, you forfeit any claim to it." The bell rang as if summoned by cue. Tuppence's eyes sparkled. Then consider peace officially over. Mrs. Calthorpe entered like a gust of anecdote in human form. She was small, round, and breathless, with the manner of one who expected the world to keep up with her and was disappointed daily when it failed. Behind her, the maid followed with a parcel of knitting and a cheerful disregard for timing. "My dears," Mrs. Calthorpe exclaimed, removing her gloves with brisk efficiency. "Such a day! Half the village in uproar over the vicar's new sermon. I told them it was bound to happen. Sermons are dangerous things. You never know what people might take personally." "Do sit down," Tuppence said sweetly, "and do tell us everything before the scones lose their purpose." The widow sat, adjusted her hat, and began the verbal equivalent of opening fire. "It's not the sermon that's interesting, really. It's what came after. You remember the fete last week? Well, some man, told the most extraordinary joke. You'd think nothing of it at first, but I've been repeating it all morning, and each time it grows queerer." Tommy, resigned to the inevitable, folded his newspaper. "What's this? A joke under police suspicion?" Mrs. Calthorpe leaned forward conspiratorially. "Now listen carefully. It begins with a banker, a colonel, and a gravedigger walking into a public house." Tuppence's brows rose. "This already sounds promising." "Oh, it gets better," said Mrs. Calthorpe. "The gravedigger says, 'I'm looking for a ledger that went missing when the dead man started smiling.' Everyone laughed, of course. Well, everyone except poor Major Denham." At the mention of the Major's name, the teacups seemed to pause mid-air. Major Denham, a retired officer who had taken the ivy-covered cottage at the end of the lane, was known for his punctual habits and his curious dislike of village chatter. He was a fixture at the post office, but rarely at the tea-table. "What did he do?" Tuppence asked. "Turned white as chalk," Mrs. Calthorpe said dramatically. "Didn't say a word, just got up and left. I thought he was going to faint, truly I did. Of course I followed him, purely out of concern, but he vanished before I could ask if he was quite all right." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. Her eyes had narrowed in that particular way that meant she'd already begun to smell a mystery. "You're sure the joke went just like that?" she asked lightly. "Oh yes, quite sure. A ledger that went missing when the dead man started smiling. Odd, isn't it? But people do love strange humour these days." "Strange indeed," Tommy murmured, "especially when it causes military men to bolt." The conversation turned to other matters, the local flower show, Mrs. Calthorpe's opinion of the postmistress's morals, and the scandal of someone painting their gate lavender. But Tuppence's thoughts stayed fixed on the image of a pale, retreating Major and a smiling corpse. When at last Mrs. Calthorpe took her leave, trailing shawl and gossip alike, the quiet that followed felt almost theatrical. Tommy rose to pour himself another cup of tea. "Well, there you have it, a minor social disturbance disguised as humour. You're not going to let it alone, are you?" "Certainly not," said Tuppence, eyes bright. "Major Denham doesn't strike me as a man easily flustered. For him to walk out over a joke, there must be something beneath it." Tommy smiled. My dear girl, you've been out of the detective business too long. You're seeing shadows in the teapot. Tuppence stood and crossed to the window. The garden outside was soft with the fading light of afternoon, the last dahlias nodding in the breeze. Perhaps, she said quietly, but some shadows are worth following. That evening, as dusk melted into a thin mist over Sutton Lee, Tommy found her seated at the writing desk, the remains of tea beside her. I've been thinking, she said, not looking up. Do you suppose the joke was something more, something coded, a reference perhaps to something Denham knew? Tommy sat opposite her. You've got that look again, the one you had before we found ourselves tied up in a cellar in Chelsea. Pure coincidence, she said innocently. But I mean it, Tommy. The words were too specific. A missing ledger, a dead man smiling. Those aren't random notions. He gave a mock sigh. All right. Suppose we grant your theory. Then what does it lead to? Some village scandal? The theft of the vicar's hymn book? Tuppence smiled faintly. Or something older. Something from before Sutton Lee was merely a place for genteel retirement. Before Tommy could reply, the telephone rang in the hall, an old black instrument whose ring sounded faintly ominous in the quiet house. Tuppence rose to answer it, half expecting Mrs. Calthorpe with an addendum to her gossip. But it was the vicar's housekeeper, her voice trembling with distress. I'm so sorry to trouble you, Mrs. Beresford, she said, but it's Major Denham. He was taken ill this afternoon. The doctor's with him now, but they say it was a dreadful shock. He keeps murmuring about smiling faces and missing pages. When Tuppence replaced the receiver, her expression had altered completely. Tommy, she said, Major Denham's collapsed, and he was speaking of the same things as in the joke. Tommy stood, the levity gone from his eyes. Then, perhaps you're right. I'd better make certain Albert hasn't burnt the toast again. Outside, the evening deepened into full twilight. A single light burned in the Denham cottage at the end of the lane, flickering faintly behind drawn curtains. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. The village seemed to hold its breath. Tuppence, gazing out into the dark, felt the first stirrings of that old familiar thrill, a mystery taking shape just beyond reach. A joke, she murmured, and yet it feels more like a warning. Tommy took her hand gently. Whatever it is, we'll find out. But I'd better make certain Albert, hasn't burnt the toast again. If we're to go sleuthing, we'll need our strength. She smiled. We always do. And as they stood together by the window, the lamplight pooling around them like a quiet promise, neither of them noticed the figure that paused briefly outside the gate, watching, waiting, before melting back into the shadows of Sutton Lee. Morning in Sutton Lee arrived with deceptive serenity. The sunlight slanted across the mist-damp hedges, painting the village in shades of mellow gold. Birds trilled industriously, and the milkman's cart rattled past the green. It was, in short, the sort of morning when one could almost believe the world harmless, unless one happened to be married to Tuppence Beresford. She appeared in the breakfast room at the Laurels, wearing a crisp blouse, and an expression that meant Tommy's plans for a quiet morning were about to expire. The newspaper lay untouched beside his toast. Tommy, she said, pouring herself tea, I've been thinking about that joke. I suspected as much, he replied, buttering his toast with the air of a man preparing for battle. May I guess? You intend to interview the vicar, the postmistress, and possibly the cat that sat under the fate tent. Tuppence ignored the remark. The fate committee keeps minutes, doesn't it? If we're to trace where the story began, that's the obvious place to start. We'll go after breakfast. Tommy groaned. I was hoping for golf. You may have both, if you manage to solve a murder before luncheon, she said sweetly. By 10 o'clock, the Beresfords were seated in the small, chilly vestry of St. Luke's Church, facing the formidable Mrs. Elspeth Partridge, secretary of the Fate Committee. She was thin, precise, and radiated the chilly authority of a woman who alphabetized her own shopping lists. The joke, you say, she repeated, tapping her pencil against her spectacles. I remember it caused something of a stir, though I can't imagine why. It was told by Mr. Vale, our new resident. Quite popular with the younger set. Writes little squibs for the Gazette. Anthony Vale, Tuppence said thoughtfully. And where might one find this master of ceremonies? Mrs. Partridge pursed her lips. He's taken rooms above the stationer's. Spends his mornings in the cafe opposite, always writing in that notebook of his. Such clever hands, though he does fidget with his sleeves dreadfully. Fidgeting can be a sign of a troubled conscience, Tuppence murmured. Or poor tailoring, Tommy added. I've been a victim of both. Mrs. Partridge's eyes softened at Tommy's gallantry, but Tuppence was already rising. Thank you, Mrs. Partridge. You've been immensely helpful. Come along, Tommy. Let's see what our humorist has to say for himself. The cafe opposite the stationer's was called the Cosy Nook, an establishment that justified only half its name. The tea was tepid, and the scones resembled geological formations. Yet the place was alive with chatter and the clink of crockery. At a corner table by the window sat a young man with neatly combed dark hair and the kind of smile that seemed permanently half-formed, as though life amused him in ways no one else could see. A notebook lay open before him, filled with quick, looping handwriting. "Mr. Vale?" Tuppence asked brightly as they approached. He looked up, startled, then recovered with a charming grin. "You've caught me, I'm afraid. Though if it's about my bill, I promise the tea wasn't worth it." Tuppence smiled. "We're not from the management. I'm Mrs. Beresford. This is my husband. We're curious about something you said at the fete." "The joke?" Vale chuckled. "I was afraid it might come to haunt me. I assure you, Mrs. Beresford, it was nothing more than idle wordplay." Tommy leaned against the counter. It caused Major Denham quite a reaction. Vale's expression faltered. His fingers moved unconsciously to his cufflinks, twisting them once, twice, then again. Yes, I did notice he looked rather unwell. I meant no harm, of course." Tuppence studied him, her gaze sharp beneath its friendly surface. It was a curious line, about the ledger and the smiling dead man. "Did you invent it yourself?" "I must have," he said after a pause. "I collect odd turns of phrase. Sometimes they appear from nowhere. You know how it is. Something drifts into your mind and you give it shape." "Indeed," said Tuppence softly, "though one does wonder what prompted it to drift into yours." Vale gave a nervous laugh. "Perhaps I should stick to limericks." As they rose to leave, Tuppence caught sight of his notebook lying half open on the table. Across one page was scrawled a short verse, half crossed out. He smiled in death, his debt unpaid. The book was lost, the jest was made. She said nothing, but her mind filed it away like a card in a cabinet. By late afternoon, the mood in Sutton Lee had shifted. Clouds gathered over the downs, and the wind began to worry at the trees. Tuppence stood at the sitting-room window, watching the path that wound toward Major Denham's cottage. She had sent a note earlier, politely requesting a word about the fete. No reply had come. Tommy entered, hat in hand. "He's not answering the door," he said. "Curtains drawn, gate bolted. Might be out." "Or avoiding visitors," said Tuppence. "Something about that man's reaction still nags me. Perhaps he just hated bad jokes." Before Tuppence could respond, the telephone shrilled in the hall. She lifted the receiver, her face changing as she listened. Yes, I understand. We'll come at once." She hung up slowly. "That was Constable Mason. Major Denham's dead." Tommy blinked. "Dead?" "Found in his garden not an hour ago. The doctor thinks it was his heart." They left immediately, the wind tugging at their coats as they made their way through the darkening lanes. Denham's cottage stood in a small copse, ivy climbing its stone walls like black veins. The constable met them at the gate, his boots muddy, his face pale. "Sad business, Mr. Beresford. Poor gentleman must have been out for some air. Doctor says heart failure. Still, there's something, unusual about it." "In what way?" Tuppence asked. Mason hesitated. "Best see for yourself, ma'am." They followed him around to the back garden. Major Denham lay slumped in a wicker chair beside the path, head tilted, one hand resting on a closed book upon his lap. The other hung limply over the armrest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and on his face, frozen in death, was the faint, unmistakable trace of a smile. Tuppence shivered. "A dead man smiling," she whispered. The constable nodded grimly. "Just like that fool joke they've been talking about. Gave me quite a turn, it did." On the path beside the wicker chair lay a damp playing card. Face up, the Joker. Tommy crouched beside the chair, studying the ground. "Any sign of a struggle?" "None. Doctor says he went peaceful-like. Only thing missing is his pocket notebook. Always carried it. Kept notes from his army days, they say. I've searched the house top to bottom. Tuppence's gaze fell to the closed book on Denham's lap. The title was faded, but she could make out English humorists of the 19th century. She touched it lightly, then withdrew her hand. A joke, a ledger, a smiling man, and a missing notebook. Tommy looked up at her. You think this wasn't natural? She hesitated. Oh, perhaps it was, but coincidence, in my experience, has a nasty sense of timing. The constable straightened. I'll need statements from both of you. You were the last to inquire after him, weren't you? Tuppence nodded absently. Yes, but not the last to speak of him, I think. As they walked back toward the village, the wind scattered dry leaves around their feet. The lamps flickered on one by one, casting pale halos on the pavement. Behind them, Denham's cottage stood silent, the smile on its late occupant's face glowing faintly in the lamplight. Tommy broke the silence. You're thinking it again. Tuppence nodded. The joke, the ledger, the smile, they're all pieces of something. Major Denham was frightened before he died, I'm sure of it, and frightened men rarely die laughing. Tommy slipped his arm around her shoulders. You do realize this means we'll have the entire constabulary tripping over us for the next week? She smiled faintly. Then we'd best be quick. The sooner we find out what Major Denham was afraid of, the better. Above them, thunder murmured far off over the hills, a low, brooding sound that seemed less like weather and more like warning. Sutton Lee, for all its charm, had begun to feel like a stage where laughter hid too many secrets. Rain had returned to Sutton Lee by morning, the kind that softened outlines and made even scandal look respectable. The village street glistened like wet slate beneath the steady drizzle, and in the laurels the smell of coffee mingled with damp wool and curiosity. Tommy Beresford was at the breakfast table with a plate of eggs cooling in front of him when Tuppence appeared, brisk and bright-eyed, as though bad weather were merely a detail to be improved upon by enterprise. There's a man from London in the village, she announced. Inspector Craddock, Scotland Yard. He's taken rooms at the inn. Tommy looked up. Ah, the heavy artillery. I suppose Sutton Lee's become a centre of national intrigue overnight. Tuppence ignored him. He's calling on us at 10. Apparently, he's heard of you. That, Tommy said, buttering toast with unnecessary emphasis, is seldom good news. At precisely 10, Inspector Craddock arrived, a tall, well-built man in his early 50s with kind grey eyes and the expression of one who had learned to distrust confessions made too readily. His manner was genial, but there was a keenness beneath it, like a steel blade hidden in velvet. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, he said, shaking hands warmly. I've been looking forward to meeting you both. I hear you have a habit of finding trouble where others find tea and biscuits. We prefer to think of it as helpful observation, said Tuppence. Won't you come in, Inspector? The fire's quite determined to behave itself today. He smiled, removing his hat and taking a seat by the hearth. I'll not refuse warmth in this weather. Now then, Major Denham, officially heart failure. The doctor's certain enough. Still, there are details that don't sit comfortably. Tuppence leaned forward. Such as? His pocket notebook's missing, the one he kept always on him. Friends and routines confirm it. And there was ink, fresh ink on his right fingertips. No inkstand near him, mind you, nor any paper but the book on his lap. English humorists, said Tommy. A grim little irony. Craddock nodded. Quite. There was also a faint trace of tobacco ash on the cuff of his coat. Pipe tobacco, not cigarettes. And yet Denham didn't smoke. Someone visited him, Tuppence murmured. That's my impression. The neighbours heard nothing, saw no one, but one of them claims a light burned in his back room well past midnight the previous evening. Perhaps he was writing, Tommy suggested. Or being written about, Craddock returned. Tuppence smiled faintly. Inspector, I think we shall get on splendidly. They adjourned to the sitting-room for tea, where Craddock produced a small leather notebook and pencil. You both were at the fete, he said. Tell me about this joke that stirred such interest. Tuppence recounted Mrs. Calthorpe's tale, the gravedigger, the ledger, and the smiling dead man, her voice calm, precise, the rhythm of someone laying clues in order. Craddock listened, motionless except for the slow tapping of his pencil against his knee. When she reached the end, he said quietly, Say that line again, the one about the missing ledger. She repeated it. I'm looking for a ledger that went missing when the dead man started smiling. Craddock's eyes sharpened. Good Lord, I haven't heard that phrase since the war. Tommy straightened. Meaning? It was used as a code, Craddock said slowly, his gaze distant for a moment. During 1943, British intelligence operations, a passphrase between field agents verifying contact. The dead man smiling, it meant success. The missing ledger referred to information gone to ground, waiting retrieval. There was a silence. Rain whispered against the windows and the clock ticked with delicate insistence. So, Tuppence said at last, our joke isn't so innocent after all. Craddock's mouth tightened. Not unless Sutton Lee has suddenly become a rendezvous for ex-agents. Tommy gave a low whistle. And Major Denham was military intelligence, wasn't he? Retired under health reasons, Craddock confirmed, but he worked with the War Office during those years. If that phrase reached him by chance, it might have meant more to him than we can guess. Could he have been blackmailed? Tuppence asked. Craddock looked at her approvingly. A possibility. The missing notebook might have held something, names, records, perhaps even a personal code key. Tuppence rose, restless. And the young man who told the joke, Anthony Vale, he claims to have made it up himself. Craddock's pencil paused. Claims? Oh, quite persuasively, she said with dry amusement, except that he turns pale whenever smiling corpses are mentioned, and he keeps twisting his cufflinks as though they might confess something on his behalf. Cufflinks? Craddock repeated, noting it down. Interesting. A nervous habit or a signal? Or simply guilt, said Tommy. Craddock smiled. You've both a tidy way of summing up character. If Mr. Vale invented that line from memory, perhaps from a story overheard years ago, he may have awakened something better left buried. Tuppence's eyes sparkled. Then we'll just have to unbury it properly. By mid-afternoon the rain had cleared, leaving the garden glazed with moisture and the air full of the smell of wet earth. Craddock lingered for another cup of tea, his manner growing less official. You've kept your wits sharp, Mrs. Beresford, he said, accepting a scone with reluctant admiration. I suppose retirement doesn't suit either of you. It's vastly overrated, Tuppence said cheerfully. Tommy plays golf and I play at intuition. I find my game more satisfying. Craddock chuckled. Well, intuition may serve you yet. There's talk at the yard that some wartime material went missing years back, records never accounted for. If Denham held one piece of that puzzle, someone might have wanted it silenced. Tommy looked thoughtful. The ledger could be literal then, an actual record. Could be, said Craddock, or symbolic. Code for a file, a list, a payment register, any number of things. Tuppence refilled his cup. Inspector, if we may offer assistance, unofficially, of course. Craddock's eyes twinkled. I thought you'd get there sooner or later. Very well. Keep your ears open. Ask discreet questions. And if this Mr. Vale sneezes, I'd like to know what handkerchief he uses. Consider it done, Tuppence said. He stood to go, buttoning his coat. One word of caution. If Denham's death connects to that old code network, there may be others watching. Don't take unnecessary risks. Tommy grinned. We specialize in necessary ones. Craddock's answering smile was brief but genuine. I'm beginning to see why the Yard keeps a special file on you two. Let's hope I shan't have to add another chapter. After the inspector's departure, Tuppence stood at the window, watching him stride down the lane toward the inn, his figure shrinking beneath the reappearing drizzle. She was silent for a long time. Tommy, lounging by the fire, finally said, You're thinking again. Yes, she said. That code phrase, it wasn't random. Vale couldn't have stumbled upon it by chance, and if Denham recognized it, he must have believed someone was sending him a message. Or warning him, said Tommy quietly. Exactly. She turned from the window. We'll pay Mr. Vale another visit tomorrow. I want to see how well he jokes when the laughter's gone. Tommy rose, stretching. You know, Tuppence, sometimes I think life with you is one long invitation to peril. She smiled. That's what keeps you young, dear. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 6, its chime rich and deliberate. Outside, the village settled into evening stillness. Lamps flickered behind curtained windows, and from somewhere distant came the faint sound of a train whistle, lonely, echoing through the damp air. Tuppence turned down the lamp beside her. A dead man smiling, a missing ledger, and an old code from the war, she said softly. If this is coincidence, it's the most elaborate one I've ever met. Tommy looked toward her, half in admiration, half in foreboding. Then I'd say, darling, the game's begun again. And as the rain whispered once more against the glass, the Beresfords sat together in the deepening light, unaware that somewhere across the village, in a dimly lit attic above the stationer's, a young man named Anthony Vale was burning a page torn from his notebook, watching it curl, blacken, and vanish in silence. The day after Inspector Craddock's visit broke bright and deceptively cheerful, as though Sutton Lee wished to deny that anything sinister could ever happen within its hedgerows. The morning light turned puddles into patches of gold, and the smell of damp grass hung in the air. Yet, beneath that calm surface, unease had taken root. Tuppence Beresford was already dressed for reconnaissance, a practical tweed skirt, stout shoes, and the expression of someone who considered curiosity an acceptable profession. Tommy, nursing his second cup of coffee, looked at her over the rim of his mug with resigned affection. "I assume," he said, "that you've thought of a reason why breaking into a deceased man's cottage before breakfast is perfectly reasonable." "I never said before breakfast," said Tuppence, fastening her brooch with a decisive click. "After breakfast. We mustn't be uncivilized. But yes, I have thought of a reason, and a rather good one." "Which is?" She turned toward him, eyes alight. "Inspector Craddock is at the coroner's office. Mrs. Calthorpe is probably recounting Denham's last smile to every available ear, which leaves his cottage unguarded. If there's anything to be found, it will be found now." Tommy sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I married an angel or an anarchist." "Both," she said cheerfully. "Do finish your coffee." Denham's cottage stood at the far end of the lane, half hidden behind a row of lilac bushes now gone to leaf. The gate creaked mournfully as they pushed it open. Tuppence paused at the threshold, taking in the little house with its low roof and whitewashed walls. There was nothing outwardly ominous about it. It was simply too neat. The curtains were precisely drawn, the brass bell polished, the front steps freshly scrubbed. Inside, the air was faintly scented with soap and something acrid beneath, a lingering trace of smoke. "Someone's been tidying," said Tommy, glancing around, which is not what one expects after a sudden death. "Unless someone wanted to erase something," said Tuppence. They moved cautiously through the rooms. Everything was in its place, too much so. The armchair's cushion had been plumped, the writing desk cleared of any papers, and the rug freshly shaken. Even the hearth had been swept clean, almost. Tuppence knelt near the fireplace, her fingers brushing a faint scorch mark on the flagstone. "This," she murmured, "wasn't here when the doctor called yesterday. Mason mentioned the fire had long gone out." Tommy crouched beside her. "Someone's been burning something." Using the poker, she stirred the ash. Beneath the grey powder, a curled scrap of half-burnt paper clung stubbornly to survival. She lifted it carefully with the tongs and laid it on a page torn from her notebook. Faded type and singed edges, but one word was still clear: nettle. Tommy whistled softly. Project Nettle. "You know it?" she asked sharply. He hesitated, frowning as he reached back through years. "Yes, it was an operation during the war. I was only at the tail end of intelligence then, but I heard of it. Nettle involved forged identification documents for agents working behind German lines. It was one of the most secret undertakings we had. Only a handful of officers even knew its scope." "And Major Denham was one of them," said Tuppence quietly. "He kept the records." She glanced again at the charred scrap. "Someone tried to destroy this, but not quite thoroughly enough. That means there's more, perhaps the rest of the ledger." "Or someone already took it," Tommy said grimly. They searched the cottage with methodical patience. Drawers yielded nothing but pressed handkerchiefs, a pair of old spectacles, and envelopes containing outdated ration cards. A wooden chest in the bedroom held only neatly folded uniforms and medals, all precisely arranged. Yet beneath the bed, Tuppence's hand brushed against something solid, a small tin box, locked. Tommy raised his brows. "Shall I fetch a hairpin, or do you carry your own?" "I came prepared," she said, producing one from her pocket. "A lady must adapt." The lock yielded after a few minutes of persuasion. Inside lay only a bundle of photographs tied with twine. Soldiers in uniform, a group before a field tent, a blurred figure shaking hands with someone in civilian dress. At the very bottom was one photograph that made Tuppence pause, a younger Denham, standing beside a man whose face was partly obscured by shadow. Both were smiling, but it was the smile that caught her attention. Forced. The smile of two men who knew more than they could afford to admit. "Do you know him?" she asked Tommy. He took the photograph, squinting. "Hard to say. Could be anyone, but there's something familiar. Perhaps from headquarters." Tuppence replaced the photo carefully. This box was meant to mislead. Whoever searched this place didn't bother taking it because they knew where the real prize lay. Meaning? Meaning Denham hid the ledger somewhere else, and someone else already knew it. They left the cottage and made their way to the Laurels, where Inspector Craddock was waiting. His hat was on the table, his raincoat steaming faintly by the fire, and his expression suggested he'd been turning thoughts over carefully and didn't like the result. "Ah," he said, rising. "I was just coming to see you. The post-mortem confirms heart failure, but the doctor notes a trace of digitalis in his bloodstream, not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to weaken the heart." Tuppence's eyes widened. "Poison, then?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps a man medicating himself too liberally. Either way, it complicates things." "We found this," she said, handing him the charred scrap. It was hidden under the hearth ash in Denham's cottage. Craddock examined it, his brows rising at the word nettle. "Well, that's interesting. Project Nettle. Yes, I remember now. It was one of those classified war initiatives. The code phrase from your joke fits the same network." "So Denham might have been holding something from those days," said Tommy. "Something dangerous." Craddock nodded slowly. "If that ledger survived, if it contains names, payments, or even evidence of double agents, then anyone implicated would have motive to silence him." "And to search his cottage," added Tuppence. "Perhaps that's why the place looked as though it had been spring-cleaned by an invisible hand." Craddock set the scrap down carefully. "The problem is, there's no sign of the complete ledger. I've questioned everyone who might have known Denham personally. The postmistress remembers him collecting parcels marked documents, but she thought them merely hobby papers. Mrs. Calthorpe insists she saw him carrying a black ledger in his briefcase just days before the fete." "Which he brought to the fete?" asked Tuppence. "Apparently not, but she said he was unsettled that afternoon, kept checking his watch and muttering about someone being late again." "Anthony Vale," said Tuppence softly. Craddock looked up. "The Joker?" She nodded. "He was at the fete, and he admits to overhearing the phrase 'dead man smiling' from Denham himself." Craddock's expression darkened. "Then Mr. Vale has some explaining to do." Evening settled over Sutton Lee like a shawl, soft but heavy with thought. The three of them sat before the fire, the flames throwing restless shadows across the walls. Outside, a light wind rattled the bare branches. Tuppence broke the silence first. "If Denham's ledger contained sensitive records, why hide it under a joke?" Craddock considered. Perhaps he feared being followed or suspected. A jest might have been his way of disguising a warning, or a message to someone who would recognize the code. Tommy leaned forward. "And whoever recognized it came for him." Tuppence looked from one man to the other, her expression sharp yet thoughtful. Suppose Denham was protecting someone else, or perhaps protecting evidence that would destroy more than one reputation. In that case, his death wasn't random at all. It was delayed retribution. "Or desperation," said Craddock. "Blackmailers are rarely patient." The fire crackled, a log collapsing into a small shower of sparks. Tuppence rose, restless again, and crossed to the window. The village lay still under a pale moon. "There's a second ledger," she said at last, voice low. "The one he died protecting. That much I'm certain of." "And what makes you so sure?" Tommy asked. She turned, eyes bright in the firelight. "Because if I were hiding something that dangerous, I'd make certain to keep one copy safe. And Denham was a cautious man." Craddock gave a slow nod. "Then the question becomes, who knows where to find it?" Tuppence's voice was almost a whisper. Someone who understands how to laugh at a secret. Outside, somewhere beyond the garden, a single laugh rang faintly through the night, sharp, mocking, and gone before either of them could be sure they'd heard it at all. Rain returned to Sutton Lee that evening with theatrical timing, beginning just as the clock on the mantel chimed 6. It pattered on the windows of the Laurels, a soft percussion that suited the mood of unease settling over the house. The lamplight gleamed on polished brass and framed photographs, all deceptively tranquil, a domestic mask for the tension underneath. Tommy Beresford, standing by the fire with his hands clasped behind his back, watched the raindrops race one another down the glass. "You know," he said conversationally, "there was a time when our mysteries involved secret codes, foreign agents and romantic subterfuge. Now it's ledger paper and village fates." Tuppence, seated opposite with a notebook open on her lap, didn't look up. "Romance is in the details, my dear, and so is murder," he grinned. "I was afraid you'd say that." Before she could answer, the front bell rang, a hesitant, almost guilty sound. A moment later, Albert, their long-suffering man of all work, appeared at the door. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's a gentleman asking to see you. Name of Vale." Tuppence rose at once. "Show him in, Albert." Anthony Vale entered like a man who had nearly turned back twice. His usually immaculate hair was damp from the rain, his expression a blend of apology and agitation. He clutched his hat in both hands as though it were a confession. "Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Beresford, forgive the intrusion. I didn't know where else to go." "You chose well," said Tuppence, motioning him toward the hearth. "Sit down before you drip yourself into pneumonia. What's happened?" Vale obeyed, glancing nervously at the shadows flickering on the walls. "I've been thinking about what I told you. That joke. It wasn't entirely invented." Tommy raised a brow. "We suspected as much." Vale's voice dropped. "I heard it from Major Denham himself, a few weeks before the fete. We met by chance at the post office. He'd mislaid a letter, and I helped him look for it. He seemed distracted, muttering about records and debts and something he called nettle. Then he laughed, a queer, bitter sort of laugh, and said, 'When the dead man starts smiling, they'll know the ledger's gone missing.'" Tuppence exchanged a quick glance with Tommy. "So, you borrowed his words for your joke?" "Yes," said Vale miserably. "It struck me as absurd at the time. I thought it one of those cryptic phrases old soldiers use. When I repeated it at the fete, I never imagined it would matter." Tommy's tone softened slightly. "You didn't know it was a code?" Vale shook his head. "I only realized later, after hearing of his death, and then there was a letter." "A letter?" Tuppence leaned forward. "Yes, it arrived 2 days ago, postmarked the morning before he died. I haven't dared tell the police. It said simply, 'If they ask about the joke, tell them the fool is smiling too.' No signature. But I swear it was Denham's handwriting." Tuppence's voice was steady. "Do you still have it?" Vale hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. "At my lodgings. I thought you ought to see it." "Then we shall," said Tuppence, already reaching for her coat. "Tommy, fetch your hat." The rain had lessened to a fine mist by the time they reached Vale's rooms above the stationer's shop. The narrow staircase smelled of paper and old varnish. Vale fumbled for his key, hands trembling, and pushed open the door, then froze. The room was in disarray. Drawers pulled open, books scattered, the small writing desk overturned. A lamp lay shattered near the window, its glass glittering like ice. But what drew their eyes was the desk itself, or rather, what was on it. A single playing card, the Joker. Craddock arrived minutes later, summoned by Albert's bicycle and a hastily scrawled note. He surveyed the scene with the calm intensity of a man assembling a puzzle in his head. "So," he said at last, lifting the card delicately by one corner, "the fool enters the game." Tuppence frowned. "You think it's symbolic?" "Oh, I think it's deliberate," said Craddock. "A message. Whoever searched this place wanted you to know they'd been here, and that they're laughing at you." Vale had sunk onto the edge of his bed, face pale. "It was here, Inspector, the letter. I kept it in the drawer with my notebooks. I only stepped out for half an hour." Craddock studied him keenly. "Did anyone know you had the letter?" "I told Mrs. Calthorpe yesterday that Denham had written to me. She asked what it said, but I only laughed it off." "Mrs. Calthorpe," repeated Tuppence slowly, "our merry gossip of Sutton Lee." Tommy crossed his arms. "If she's connected to this, I'll eat Albert's umbrella." Tuppence gave him a look. "Let's not underestimate the power of idle tongues. Information leaks in odd directions." Craddock pocketed the card carefully. "We'll have this examined for prints, though I doubt we'll find any. The Joker, eh? Rather on the nose, don't you think?" Tommy nodded toward Vale. "Perhaps our friend here was the intended fool." Vale flinched. "You think I'm involved?" "I think you're frightened," said Tommy quietly. and fear sometimes makes people do foolish things. Craddock's expression softened. Mr. Vale, we're not accusing you, yet, but someone seems to believe you know more than you do. That makes you a target. Vale swallowed hard. Then what should I do? Stay visible, said Tuppence, and stop fidgeting with your cufflinks. It's like a beacon to whoever's watching. He dropped his hands at once, flushing. Old habit. Yes, she said softly, but old habits often start from new guilt. Back at the Laurels, Craddock joined them for a late supper. The rain had stopped, leaving a faint smell of damp earth drifting in through the open window. A single lamp cast a warm glow across the table where bread, cheese, and Tuppence's notebook shared equal importance. So, Craddock said between thoughtful bites, Denham's phrase becomes the centre of things. He used it to mean something. Vale repeated it publicly. Within days, Denham's dead and Vale's letter vanishes. Whoever this joker is, they don't appreciate repetition. Tommy leaned back. It feels staged, doesn't it? Like a play. The smiling dead man, the missing ledger, the fool's card. Someone's writing the script for us. And we, said Tuppence, are the audience meant to laugh at the wrong moment. Craddock gave a dry smile. Perhaps, but we've one advantage. We're listening between the lines. He rose, stretching. I'll be in London tomorrow to check Denham's wartime record. If Project Nettle ties to any surviving agents, we may find our motive there. In the meantime, keep your ears open and your door locked. Inspector, said Tuppence as she saw him to the door, if you were to guess, what sort of person plays the Joker? He paused, hand on the doorknob. Someone who thinks life's a performance, he said, and enjoys setting the stage. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Tuppence sat alone in the parlour, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Tommy entered softly, 2 cups of cocoa in hand. You're thinking about Vale, he said, handing her one. I'm thinking about everyone, she replied. Vale's frightened, yes, but fear can be faked. He's clever, and clever men sometimes pretend weakness to hide strength. Tommy sat opposite her. So, you think he's acting? I think he's part of something larger. Maybe willingly, maybe not. But that letter, the fool is smiling too. It feels like a warning. Perhaps to him, perhaps to us. Tommy took a sip of cocoa, grimaced, and said, Remind me why every conversation in this house ends with murder. Because murder, said Tuppence, smiling faintly, is the most human of puzzles, and humanity never stays quiet for long. She rose, crossing to the window. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the garden silvered by moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight. The sound was crisp, precise, like the ticking of fate. Behind her, Tommy said, So, what's our next move, partner of mine? She turned, eyes bright. We start with laughter, Tommy. Someone's using humour as camouflage, jokes, smiles, cards. But the thing about laughter is it leaves an echo. We'll follow it, he grinned. Then here's to chasing the echo. They clinked their cups together, the soft sound mingling with the faint hiss of the dying fire. Outside, unseen from the window, a lone figure stood at the edge of the lane beneath the dripping lilacs, watching the house. The figure struck a match, lit a cigarette, and as the flame flared briefly, a small white shape fluttered from his gloved hand. A playing card. The Joker. It tumbled once in the breeze, landed face up on the wet ground, and lay there, smiling. Morning broke grey and reluctant, as though the sky itself wished to delay the day's discoveries. A faint fog drifted through Sutton Lee, clinging to the hedges and softening every edge into something uncertain. Inside the Laurels, however, purpose was already awake. Tuppence Beresford sat before a small pile of papers, letters, and photographs spread across the dining table, like the remains of an untidy séance. Tommy, halfway through his coffee, regarded her warily, as one might observe a scientist on the verge of an explosion. You've been at that since dawn, he said. Even Albert's coffee can't justify such dedication. Tuppence didn't glance up. I found this among Denham's papers, tucked behind a drawer lining. I think it was meant to stay hidden. She held up a photograph, a sepia print, slightly curled at the edges. The image showed a woman in a wartime nurse's uniform, her expression serene yet guarded, as though smiling for a photographer she didn't entirely trust. Beneath the soft light of the lamp, her features seemed to shift, Gentle one moment, distant the next. Pretty, said Tommy, but hardly damning. Wait for it, Tuppence murmured, turning the photo over. On the back, written in elegant slanted hand, were 6 words, to J.D., until they stopped laughing. Tommy frowned. J.D., Denham, obviously, but what does the rest mean? That's the question, isn't it? She studied the inscription again. Until they stopped laughing, the laughter again, the same word that keeps turning up like a refrain. Tommy poured more coffee. You think she's connected to his death? I think she's the next piece of the puzzle, said Tuppence, and her uniform tells me exactly where to start. By mid-morning, Tuppence and Tommy were walking up the gravel drive of Sutton Lee Nursing Home, an old Georgian manor-turned-convalescent house. The building sat slightly apart from the village, its windows shuttered against the damp wind. A row of weary elms bowed toward it, as though listening for secrets. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender polish. A nurse in crisp uniform led them to a sitting room overlooking the garden, where a few elderly residents dozed under crocheted blankets. At a writing desk near the window sat a woman of about 60, her silver hair pinned with military precision and her posture too straight for comfort. Miss Albright, Tuppence asked gently. The woman looked up. Her eyes, pale blue, sharp despite the years, lingered on Tuppence's face, then shifted to Tommy with measured suspicion. Yes, she said. You're the Beresfords. I was told you might call. The inspector mentioned you were poking around in Denham's affairs. Poking around is such a crude term, said Tuppence pleasantly. We prefer following threads, and I think one of those threads leads here. Miss Albright's smile didn't reach her eyes. Denham and I served together. Casualty Evacuation Unit, France 44, good officer, not always wise in his friendships. Tuppence withdrew the photograph from her handbag and slid it across the table. Then you may recognize this. The woman's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her fingers froze midway to her teacup. A tremor passed through the porcelain, producing a faint chime. She recovered almost at once, taking the photograph with careful fingers. I remember her, she said after a pause. Nurse Lillian Grant. She worked with us for a time. Brilliant nurse, though she laughed too easily, even in the worst conditions, drove Denham half mad. Tommy tilted his head. He didn't care for laughter. Miss Albright's mouth twisted faintly. He thought it made people careless. He used to say, when they start laughing, they stop watching. But Lillian, she had a way of making people forget where they were, including Denham. A romance? Asked Tuppence. Something like it, Albright said coolly, but it ended badly. She was transferred after a misunderstanding over some missing medical records. Missing records, Tuppence repeated. A trivial matter, Albright said too quickly. War breeds confusion. Tuppence leaned forward slightly. Miss Albright, the inscription on the back, until they stop laughing. It sounds like a private message. Do you know what it means? The woman's eyes flickered toward the window, then back. Some private joke, I expect. Perhaps, said Tuppence softly. But Denham died with a smile on his face, and that doesn't strike me as funny. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, brittle like spun glass. Then Albright stood. I'm afraid that's all I can tell you. The past is best left buried. Unfortunately, said Tuppence, rising, the past seems unwilling to stay there. They left the nursing home just as the clouds broke, letting a brief shaft of sunlight fall across the drive. Tommy was silent until they reached the car. She knows more than she's saying, he said. Of course she does, Tuppence replied, and she's frightened. Did you see her hands? She was trembling. She mentioned missing records, said Tommy. That could tie directly to Denham's ledger. Exactly, said Tuppence. If this nurse Grant was involved, she might have known about Project Nettle. And if Albright was there too, Tommy nodded grimly, then the war's ghosts are walking again. That evening, the mood at the Laurels was quieter than usual. The lamps burned low, the fire crackled, and the wind muttered against the eaves. Tuppence sat near the hearth, reviewing her notes, while Tommy pretended to read the Times. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Albert entered, cap in hand. Message from the nursing home, ma'am. Urgent. Said to tell you Miss Albright's had a fall. Tuppence was on her feet before he finished. Is she alive? Doctor's with her now, unconscious but breathing. They were at the nursing home within 15 minutes. The corridors, normally tranquil, hummed with subdued alarm. A nurse led them upstairs to a narrow room where Miss Albright lay pale and still, a bandage around her head. Her bedside table had been knocked over, scattering its contents. Craddock stood at the foot of the bed, his expression grim. "Accident, they say. I'm not convinced." "What happened?" asked Tommy. One of the attendants heard a crash around 8. Found her on the floor by the window. No sign of forced entry, but the window latch was unfastened. And this. He lifted a small plastic evidence bag. Inside lay a single playing card. The Joker. Tuppence stared at it, the air seeming to drain from the room. "Another message," Craddock nodded. "Whoever's behind this isn't done. They knew we'd come to her." "Then it wasn't a coincidence," said Tuppence. "Someone's been watching every step." The inspector's voice dropped. "I'll post a constable outside her door tonight. If she wakes, I'll want her statement at once." "Do you think she'll recover?" Tommy asked quietly. "Hard to say," said Craddock. "The doctor's uncertain, but she's strong." Tuppence's eyes lingered on the unconscious woman. Strong and frightened. She wanted to tell us something but couldn't. Maybe she was trying to protect someone, or herself. Craddock glanced toward the window. "We found footprints in the flower bed outside. Size 9, men's standard sole. Could be anyone's. Could be our Joker." "Or Vale," said Tommy. Tuppence shook her head. "No, he hasn't the nerve." "Then who?" asked Craddock. Tuppence turned back to the bed, studying the still form. "Someone who served with her. Someone who knows the old secrets. Someone who's been laughing at us all along." They left the nursing home near midnight. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the lane ahead. As the car bumped slowly along the road, Tuppence sat deep in thought, the photograph clutched in her gloved hands. "Tommy," she said at last, "that inscription, until they stop laughing, it isn't a jest. It's a threat, a promise of silence." He glanced at her. "You think the laughter isn't symbolic anymore?" "No, it's literal. Each person tied to Nettle, Denham, Vale, now Albright, has been warned or attacked under that same motif. Someone's using their own joke against them." "Then there's still someone left to silence," Tommy murmured. Tuppence nodded slowly. "And I intend to find out who." Back at the Laurels, the hour was late and the village silent. Tuppence laid the photograph on the mantel, the woman's faint smile catching the firelight. For a fleeting moment, it seemed almost alive, a secret smile, conspiratorial and knowing. Tommy joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You know," he said softly, "there's something haunting about that face." "She looks like she's hiding laughter," said Tuppence, "or guilt." The flames guttered, sending shadows flickering up the walls. For the briefest instant, it almost seemed as though the woman in the photograph smiled wider. A trick of the light, or something darker. Tuppence turned away. Outside, the wind rose, and the laughter motif, faint, eerie, and distant, echoed once more across Sutton Lee. It was one of those afternoons when the world seemed to hold its breath, the sky grey but still, the air faintly sweet from a drizzle that had passed hours before. The Laurels wore a deceptive serenity. The lace curtains were drawn just so, the fire murmured in the grate, and the tea service gleamed like a small promise of civilization against the encroaching storm. Yet beneath that genteel surface, tension simmered. For Tuppence Beresford, arranging the tea tray was less about hospitality and more about strategy. "Every battlefield needs its proper terrain," she murmured, adjusting the placement of the scones. Tommy, lounging in an armchair with deceptive ease, raised a brow. "I was under the impression this was tea, not Waterloo." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Same principle. One must lure one's opponents into comfort before asking them inconvenient questions." "Well," he said, "the table's laid, the traps are set, and the kettle's plotting treason. Shall I fetch the guests?" "Do," said Tuppence, "before Mrs. Calthorpe gets distracted by the grocer's window and decides to spread the gospel of gossip elsewhere." Within the hour, the little sitting room at the Laurels was a tableau of village personalities, genteel, nervous, and very slightly off balance. Mrs. Calthorpe sat nearest the fire, wrapped in shawl and importance, her expression one of benevolent curiosity. Anthony Vale had taken up a post near the window as though contemplating escape. The vicar, Reverend Sims, looked ill at ease, his collar gleaming against a complexion that was a shade too pink. Tommy, ever the genial host, poured tea with studied innocence. "Sugar, Reverend? Or do you take it black, like your sermons?" The vicar gave a weak laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tuppence smiled graciously as she accepted her cup. "I'm so glad you could all come. I thought, after all the excitement of recent days, a little gathering might help clear the air." "Quite right, my dear," said Mrs. Calthorpe, already reaching for the cucumber sandwiches. "A touch of scandal can ruin digestion if one isn't careful." "Scandal?" said the vicar, looking alarmed. "Surely you don't mean—" "Oh, nothing dreadful," said Tuppence smoothly. "Only this odd business about Major Denham and the dreadful coincidences surrounding him. We do seem to have inherited his mystery." Anthony Vale set his cup down with a clink. "I wish you wouldn't call it his mystery. I had nothing to do with his death, I assure you." "Of course you didn't," said Tuppence gently, "though you did repeat his joke rather memorably. One might almost call it prophetic." The young man flushed. "You make it sound sinister." "Everything sounds sinister," said Tuppence lightly, "once someone dies with a smile on their face." There was a small, collective silence. Only the clock ticked steadily in the corner. Mrs. Calthorpe was the first to speak, her voice full of false brightness. "Well, I must say, I've never known anything like it. Telegrams, policemen, all these dreadful rumours. I told Mrs. Peveril this morning that if it goes on much longer, Sutton Lee will end up in the newspapers, and then where shall we be?" "Possibly on page 3, murmured Tommy. Tuppence shot him a look but couldn't suppress a smile. Then, turning back to her guests, she said, "The thing is, there seems to be a connection between Major Denham's past and that peculiar phrase from the Fate. Inspector Craddock thinks it relates to something called Project Nettle." The reaction was immediate, though carefully masked. Vale's hand twitched toward his cufflinks. The vicar's teacup rattled on its saucer. Miss Albright lowered her gaze entirely, her lips pressing into a bloodless line. Only Mrs. Calthorpe looked cheerfully mystified. "Project Nettle," she repeated. "Sounds like gardening. Is it something to do with weeds?" "Something like that," said Tuppence dryly. "It's a wartime operation, or so we believe, a rather secret one." Reverend Sim's voice cut through the air, quiet but firm. "You shouldn't speak of it." All eyes turned to her. She realized she'd spoken too quickly and tried to recover. "I only mean, it's so long ago. There's no sense stirring up memories that ought to stay buried." "Memories," said Tuppence softly, "have a habit of digging themselves up when ignored." Anthony Vale stood suddenly. "Really, Mrs. Beresford, must we continue this? I came because you asked, not to be interrogated over teacups." Tuppence's tone was smooth, almost apologetic. "Forgive me, Mr. Vale. You're right, of course. But if Major Denham trusted you enough to write, perhaps he also trusted you enough to tell something of importance." "I've told you everything," Vale snapped. "He sent me that letter, and now it's gone, stolen. Isn't that enough to convince you someone else is pulling the strings?" "Perhaps," said Tommy, watching him. "But strings can pull both ways." Vale looked at him sharply, then turned toward the window as if the answer might lie somewhere in the darkening garden. The atmosphere thickened. The ticking of the mantel clock grew intrusive, almost accusatory. Miss Albright sat rigid, her cup untouched. "Miss Albright," said Tuppence suddenly, her voice gentle, "I wonder if you might tell us about Nurse Grant." Reverend Sim's head lifted. "I already have." "But not everything," said Tuppence. "The inscription on the photograph, until they stopped laughing. What did it mean?" The vicar's composure faltered. "It was nothing, a joke between them." "Ah," said Tuppence softly. "That word again." Before Miss Albright could reply, Mrs. Calthorpe gave a small gasp. "You mean the woman in the picture? Oh, I saw her once, years ago, at the Fete after the war, with Major Denham. Pretty thing, but rather sly. She had a way of looking at you as if she knew all your secrets. I remember telling the vicar—" "I should prefer," interrupted Reverend Sim stiffly, "that we not discuss gossip during tea." "Quite right, Reverend," said Tuppence, smiling sweetly. "Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss Project Nettle instead." His teacup clattered again. "My dear Mrs. Beresford, I don't know anything about military matters." "No?" said Tuppence, her gaze unwavering. "And yet, I'm told the church registry from 1943 lists you as having served briefly with the chaplaincy corps in France, near Caen, the same sector where Denham and Miss Albright were stationed. The vicar's mouth opened and closed like a stranded fish. Well, briefly, yes, but I had no knowledge of any projects. Of course not, murmured Tuppence. Only it's strange that everyone who did seems to have been in Sutton Lee these last months. Tommy rose and moved to the sideboard, giving the room a reprieve as he poured more tea. The scrape of silver on china was the only sound. Then came a knock at the door, sharp, official. Albert entered, his face pale. "Inspector Craddock's here, ma'am." The inspector stepped in without ceremony, shaking off rain from his coat. His usual geniality was absent. His face was drawn, his eyes hard. "Apologies for intruding," he said, glancing at the assembled company. "But I've just come from the post office. A telegram arrived for Major Denham this morning, delayed in delivery. It was sent from Geneva, 4 days before his death." "Geneva?" said Tommy. "Who from?" Craddock unfolded the slip. "No name, only this. They remember the joke. Leave before it's too late." A murmur went through the room. Even Mrs. Calthorpe's chatter dried up. Tuppence leaned forward. "So someone warned him?" Craddock nodded grimly. "And he didn't listen. Which makes me wonder, who else here received a warning and ignored it?" His gaze swept the table. Vale's knuckles whitened on the back of his chair. The vicar's hand went to his collar again. Miss Albright sat like stone. Mrs. Calthorpe broke the silence, her voice trembling now. "You mean to say, one of us?" Craddock's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "You're all connected, one way or another. Wartime acquaintances, shared secrets, lingering loyalties. Someone here knows who sent that telegram, or why Denham had to die." Tuppence met his glance. "And someone's been laughing at all of us since the beginning." The silence that followed was the sort that hums with unspoken truths. The fire gave a low sigh, collapsing on itself. Finally, Reverend Sims rose, his hand shaking as he set down his cup. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Beresford, I've parish duties." "Of course, Reverend," said Tuppence sweetly, "though I dare say the Lord will forgive a brief delay for earthly matters." He didn't reply, only bowed slightly and left, his gait unsteady. Anthony Vale followed soon after, muttering something about needing air. Miss Albright excused herself with the nurse's dignity of one too brittle to break publicly. Mrs. Calthorpe, to her credit, lingered long enough to ask if she might take the leftover scones for the vicarage. When the door finally closed behind them, the quiet that settled was absolute. Craddock exhaled, rubbing his brow. "Well, that's done it." "What has?" asked Tommy. "I've just watched 4 people behave as though they've been handed a death sentence," he said. "Whatever Denham uncovered, it's alive, and it's scaring them stiff." Tuppence turned toward the fire, her expression thoughtful. "Then the tea of truth was successful." Tommy smiled faintly. "Successful?" She nodded. "Oh, yes. The guilty always show their tells, and today everyone smiled, but not one of them meant it." The clock struck 6. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the downs. Inside, the last of the firelight caught the edges of the teacups, each one marked by the faint trace of a smile in red lipstick, trembling hands, or nervous sweat. A fool's game had turned deadly, and the laughter was growing louder. The wind that night had the low, unbroken note of something alive, a mournful voice moving through the trees, as if it remembered every secret the countryside had ever whispered. Clouds lay heavy over the moon, and the road that led to Nettle Hall gleamed faintly in the lantern light of the car, a ribbon of silver between the hedges. Tommy drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw set. Beside him, Tuppence sat forward in her seat, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap, her eyes trained on the darkness ahead. In the back, Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "The caretaker swears the place is empty. Hasn't been lived in since '46. Still, I'd prefer if you two stayed behind me once we're inside." "Of course, Inspector," said Tuppence, tone perfectly obedient, which Tommy knew meant she was planning precisely the opposite. The car turned off the main lane onto a gravel drive overgrown with weeds. Through the mist, the outline of the old house emerged, sprawling, 3 stories high, its windows black and unwelcoming. Nettle Hall had once been proud, even elegant, but now it crouched like a beast in the dark, its roofline broken, its stonework streaked with age. As they stepped out, the air carried the smell of damp wood and decay. A sign hung crookedly on the gate, "Private property, no trespassing." "Comforting," Tommy muttered. "At least the ghosts are polite." Craddock's torch swept over the front door, catching on the rusted lock. "The caretaker left the key under the step," he said. "Charming bit of security." The door creaked open under his hand, and a gust of stale air met them, thick with the scent of dust, mould, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the entrance hall stretched wide and dim, its floor littered with fallen plaster. The beam of Craddock's torch slid across the grand staircase, its banister festooned with cobwebs, and paused on a portrait hanging crookedly at the landing. A man in uniform, eyes sharp, expression grim. "Denham," said Tuppence softly. "Looks the sort who'd frighten his own reflection," murmured Tommy. They advanced slowly. Every footstep sent echoes bouncing along the corridor like whispers. Wallpaper peeled from the walls, furniture stood ghost-like under shrouds, and in one corner an old umbrella stand leaned as though tired of keeping vigil. Craddock led the way up the stairs, his flashlight cutting a bright path through the gloom. "Caretaker said there's a study on the top floor," he said. "That's where Denham kept his personal papers before the family sold up." Tuppence's voice came from behind him, calm but intent, and perhaps where he hid what he couldn't destroy. The study was at the end of a long corridor, behind a heavy oak door swollen with damp. When Craddock forced it open, dust rose in a soft grey cloud. The smell of old paper and neglect filled the air. The beam of light revealed a large room lined with shelves, most of them empty. An enormous desk stood under the window, its surface buried beneath curled sheets of paper, faded maps, and a broken lamp. Tuppence crossed to it at once, brushing away a film of dust. "Look at this," she said. "Everything's been left as it was. It's as though someone simply walked out and never came back." Tommy joined her, peering over her shoulder. Judging by the dust, they also never cleaned up afterward. Craddock, meanwhile, moved methodically through the shelves, examining each binder and folder. He was thorough, he said. No diaries, no correspondence, no, not a scrap of personal writing. Tuppence crouched near the hearth. A stack of blackened pages lay among the ashes. She lifted one carefully, the paper brittle between her fingers. "Half burned," she murmured. "He tried to destroy them." Craddock leaned over her shoulder. "Can you read anything?" She squinted at the charred edge. Only a heading, Project Nettle. The inspector's eyes met hers. So it's true. Tuppence spread another fragment on the desk. The ink had bled and faded, but a few lines were legible, a series of dates, figures, and names written in a precise hand. Tommy frowned. "Payments. All amounts in pounds, followed by initials. M.A. C.R.A.V. He stopped. His gaze flicked up to Tuppence. A.V. Anthony Vale. Tuppence's breath caught. It can't be coincidence. Craddock pulled a small magnifying lens from his pocket and bent closer. It's the same hand as Denham's service records. He kept a list of payments to double agents, hush money perhaps, or rewards for betrayal, and one of them was Vale. "Blackmail," said Tuppence softly. "Denham must have kept the ledger as leverage, and when he tried to warn Vale with that letter, someone silenced him," Craddock finished grimly. They heard the noise then, faint from somewhere below, a door closing, softly. Tommy straightened. "We're not alone." Craddock motioned for silence, his hand going instinctively to the revolver at his belt. The wind outside had risen, and the windows rattled in their frames. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Slow, measured, approaching. Craddock moved to the doorway, torch raised. "Who's there?" No reply. Only the sound of breathing, very close. Then into the torchlight stepped Anthony Vale. His face was pale, his hair damp from the mist. He looked exhausted, cornered, yet defiant. "I might ask you the same," he said hoarsely. "You've no right to be here." "Neither have you," said Craddock sharply. "This is police business." Vale's eyes darted to the desk, to the charred ledger. His expression changed, fear, then resignation. "You found it." Tuppence's tone was steady. "You were on Denham's list, Mr. Vale. Care to tell us why?" He sank into the nearest chair, running a trembling hand through his hair. "It's not what you think. I was young, Foolish. During the war, I worked on a courier route through France. Denham caught me passing information to a girl, a local contact, or so I thought. She turned out to be working for the other side. Denham saved me from court-martial, but he never forgot. He made me pay, every year, a little more. Money, favours, lies. "And you paid," said Tommy quietly. Vale nodded. "Because he held the ledger. My name, my shame, everything. He said if he died it would surface. I thought he was bluffing. I was wrong." "Did you kill him?" Craddock asked. Vale looked up sharply. "No, God no. I went to see him, yes, the day before the fete. He was agitated, said he'd been threatened, but he refused to leave, said he had to finish something. The next thing I heard, he was dead." Tuppence studied him carefully. "And you came here tonight because I got this." He reached into his coat and produced a folded slip of paper. "Delivered to my door this morning, no signature." Craddock unfolded it and read aloud. "Nettle Hall, midnight. The dead still smile. Come if you want the truth." Tommy exhaled softly. "Our Joker has a flair for theatre." Before anyone could reply, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Loud, sharp, final. The wind howled in response. Craddock spun toward the corridor. "Stay here." But Tuppence caught his arm. "No, Inspector, that's what they want." A shot rang out. The sound tore through the silence like a whip crack. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Vale shouted and dropped to the floor. Craddock lunged toward the doorway, pistol raised. "Down!" he barked. Another shot, closer this time from the stairwell. Then footsteps, rapid, retreating. Tommy darted to the window. "There! Someone's running toward the gate." Craddock fired once, the bullet striking the doorframe as the figure vanished into the darkness. Tuppence knelt beside Vale. "You're hit?" He shook his head, breathing hard. "No, missed me, but they meant it." Craddock swore under his breath. "They knew we'd be here. Someone tipped them off." Tuppence stood slowly, her face pale but determined. Then the laughter wasn't finished after all. "Whoever fired that gun isn't done yet, not until the whole ledger's gone." Craddock holstered his revolver. "I'll have men search the grounds. No one leaves this place till I say so." Vale stared at the half-burned pages on the desk, his expression haunted. "Denham tried to destroy it. He couldn't. None of us can we? It's like the war never ended, only changed its disguise." Tuppence laid a hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps, but sooner or later, every shadow meets the light." Tommy turned toward the window where dawn's first glimmer was struggling through the clouds. "If this is what dawn looks like," he said quietly, "I'd hate to see midnight again." By the time they left Nettle Hall, the storm had broken. Rain fell in silver sheets, washing the dust from the old stones. Behind them the house stood silent, brooding, a monument to secrets that refused to die. In the car, Craddock drove, his jaw set. Tuppence sat beside him, the rescued pages folded carefully in her lap. "Half a ledger," she said, "half a truth, but it's enough to know Denham wasn't the only one with something to hide." Tommy glanced over from the back seat. "And the other half?" Craddock's eyes were on the road. "We'll find it," he said grimly, "because whoever fired that gun tonight, they just told us where to look next." Tuppence's gaze drifted to the blurred outline of Nettle Hall in the rear window, fading into the rain. "And what's that, Inspector?" Craddock's voice was low. "To the one person who keeps laughing." And outside, faintly through the roar of the storm, the echo of that laughter, distant, mocking, unmistakable, followed them down the road. Fog had swallowed the grounds of Nettle Hall whole, leaving only the faint glow of Craddock's lanterns cutting uncertain paths through the darkness. The rain had stopped, but mist still clung to the stones, ghostly and thick, wrapping the old estate in its own silence. Inside, the house felt alive, its corridors breathing draughts, its windows whispering. Somewhere in those long, cold passages a door slammed. Tommy spun toward the sound. "This way," he called, and the echo of his voice vanished up the staircase. Craddock's voice came from below. "Careful, Beresford, she's armed." But Tommy was already moving. His shoes slipped on the warped boards as he reached the upper landing. A faint beam of light flashed ahead, the sweep of a torch, disappearing through a half-open door at the far end of the hall. He pressed himself against the wall, heart thudding. He could hear the hurried scrape of shoes, the rustle of skirts. Then, silence. He pushed the door open. The beam of his torch caught her in mid-turn. Miss Albright. Her bandaged head gleamed pale in the dark, her face drawn, wild-eyed. One hand clutched a small pistol, the other gripped the desk for balance. "Miss Albright," Tommy said softly, his voice calm but edged, "you'll forgive the intrusion. You left your manners and your conscience somewhere behind you." Her lips tightened. "Where's Mrs. Beresford?" "On her way," he said, "and Craddock's not far behind. Best to put the gun down before things turn unpleasant." She gave a soft, humourless laugh. "Unpleasant? You have no idea what unpleasant is, Mr. Beresford. Denham learned. He tried to make me remember, but I never forgot." Tommy stepped closer, careful, his hands raised slightly. "Then why run?" "Because running's all that's left," she said. "You think I'm afraid of the law?" "No, I'm afraid of laughter, of ghosts who won't stop mocking me." There was madness in her voice, not the hysterical kind, but the brittle, exhausted madness of guilt carried too long. Before Tommy could answer, footsteps echoed in the hall. Tuppence appeared in the doorway, lantern in hand, her face pale but steady. "Miss Albright," she said quietly, "you've done enough running for one lifetime. Tell us what really happened." For a long moment, the older woman said nothing. Then, with a sudden, trembling breath, she lowered the pistol to the desk and sank into the nearest chair. The misty light from the window haloed her like a weary ghost. "It began in France," she said, her voice flat but steady. 1944. Denham and I were assigned to an operation. Nettle, yes, though no one dared speak its name aloud. We were meant to smuggle false identities to informants hiding behind enemy lines. One of them was a double agent feeding both sides. We learned too late. Her eyes flickered upward, catching the lamp glow. A raid was planned. We couldn't expose him without exposing ourselves. So Denham and I did the only thing we could. We staged his death, burned the safe house, forged the report. The man vanished into smoke. "You mean," Tuppence said, "you let a traitor live?" Miss Albright nodded once. "We thought it cleaner than execution. We were fools. After the war, that man resurfaced, with friends. Blackmail, espionage, corruption, all built on what we'd buried. Denham wanted to stop him. I wanted to survive." She laughed again, low and bitter. "When he began keeping the ledger, I warned him it would destroy us both. He said the truth had to out, that no one should profit from betrayal. But when he spoke of revealing everything, I reminded him of our secret, our joke." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "The joke from the fate." "Yes," Miss Albright's voice broke. "It wasn't a joke to us. It was our signal phrase, a reminder of the night we faked that death. When the dead man starts smiling, the ledger goes missing." He understood what it meant. When I repeated it to him weeks ago, I only meant to warn him to stay silent. But that fool Vale, she spat the name, he took it for comedy. He said it aloud to half the village, and suddenly everyone was laughing, everyone but me. She pressed a shaking hand to her temple. "So yes, I went to Denham's that night. We argued. He said he'd burned half the ledger, hidden the rest. I begged him to stop. He laughed, said the war had never ended, only changed its uniforms. That laughter, I hear it still." Tuppence's voice was soft, but it carried. "You shot him?" Miss Albright looked up sharply. "No, he died of his own heart. I only frightened him. When he fell, I thought, perhaps justice had chosen for me. I left before dawn, but I didn't kill him." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. "And the Joker cards?" Miss Albright frowned, confused. "What?" "The cards left at the scenes," Tuppence said. "At your bedside, in Vale's room, and by Denham's garden chair. The Joker, mocking, smiling." "I know nothing of them," said Albright quickly. "I swear it." Her reaction was genuine. Fear, not guilt. Tommy could see it. Her eyes were darting, uncertain, but not deceptive. Tuppence stepped closer, the lantern's light flickering over the old nurse's face. "Then you didn't send the telegram from Geneva either? The one warning Denham to leave before it was too late?" "No," her voice cracked. "I haven't left England in years." "Then there's someone else," said Tommy. Someone who knew the phrase, the ledger, the signal, and who wants to finish what you started. Miss Albright buried her face in her hands. You don't understand. There can't be anyone else. Only Denham and I knew that phrase. The others died long ago. Not all, said Tuppence quietly. The man whose death you staged, he didn't die, remember? He's still out there, watching, laughing. The room went very still. Miss Albright raised her head slowly, her face ashen. No, she whispered. Impossible. We destroyed his file. Tommy nodded toward the ledger on the desk. Perhaps not completely. Footsteps again, heavier this time, running along the corridor. Craddock burst through the door, revolver drawn. She's not alone, he said breathlessly. Someone's in the west wing. Saw a shadow on the stairs. Vale? Asked Tuppence. Craddock shook his head. Too tall. Moved like a soldier. Miss Albright made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. You see? It's him. He's come back. Tuppence turned to the inspector. Seal the exits. Whoever's here won't get far. Craddock nodded and vanished down the hall. Tommy crossed to the window. The mist outside swirled like smoke, swallowing the lawn and trees. Somewhere beyond, a faint crunch of gravel echoed, the sound of footsteps moving swiftly toward the side gate. He turned. They're running. Tuppence grabbed her coat. Then so are we. They followed the sound through the narrow passageways, the beams of their torches slicing through the foggy gloom. The air smelled of damp wood and old secrets. From somewhere ahead came the slam of an outside door. They burst through into the courtyard. The moon had reappeared, a dull coin behind the clouds. At the far end of the gravel path, a figure moved. A man, cloaked and quick, heading toward the trees. Stop! Craddock's voice rang out from the other side of the courtyard. The figure turned, just for a heartbeat, and the light caught his face. Tuppence froze. Good heavens, the vicar! Reverend Sims hesitated, then bolted into the mist. Tommy and Craddock gave chase, their footsteps pounding over the wet ground. The fog closed around them, thick and white. They caught sight of him again, struggling with the latch on a rusted gate that led toward the river. "Hold it right there, Reverend," shouted Craddock. The vicar turned, and for a moment his calm, saintly mask cracked. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I did it for them, for all of us." Then, with sudden fury, he raised something, a small revolver. The barrel gleamed dully. Craddock fired first. The report echoed across the empty fields. The vicar staggered, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. Craddock ran forward, kicking the gun aside. "Get a light over here." Tuppence's lantern beam found the man's face. He was breathing, but faintly. His eyes were glassy, full of pain, and something like relief. "I thought it was over," he murmured. Denham was going to expose us all. The ledger. It wasn't just blackmail, it was judgment. Tuppence knelt beside him. "You were the one sending the cards?" He gave a weak smile. "Yes. The joker. The fool. I thought, if I could frighten them, perhaps they'd stay silent. But Albright, Vale, they panicked. Too many ghosts." His voice faltered. He should never have laughed. It was his laughter that started it all. "Whose?" asked Tuppence. "Denham's?" "No," whispered the vicar. "The dead man we buried alive." His eyes closed. The fog swallowed his last breath. Craddock exhaled. He admits leaving the jokers at Vale's rooms and the nursing home, but not the first one at Denham's. They stood there a long moment, the mist curling around them, the silence broken only by the wind in the trees. Craddock holstered his weapon, his face grim. "We'll need to confirm everything, but if what he said's true, Denham, Albright, Vale and the vicar, they all shared the same crime." "Faking a death," said Tommy, "and paying for it ever since." Tuppence's gaze drifted toward the river, its surface pale and shifting. "And the laughter," she murmured. "It wasn't joy. It was guilt echoing through the years." Craddock turned to her. "We'll take them all in for statements. I'll have men secure this place till morning." Tuppence nodded absently. Her eyes were still on the trees beyond, where the fog had begun to lift. The moonlight caught the old stone of Nettle Hall, making it gleam wetly, like something newly unearthed. Tommy touched her arm. "You're shivering." She smiled faintly. "Not from cold, dear. Just the realization that the dead don't always stay buried. Not when the living keep telling their jokes." Later, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Craddock's car waited at the gate. Miss Albright sat inside, silent, hands folded in her lap. Vale stood apart, his expression dazed. Tuppence paused before climbing in, glancing back one last time. Through the thinning fog, the windows of Nettle Hall looked almost bright, like the hollow eyes of something that had finally finished watching. Tommy joined her. "What are you thinking?" "That there's one detail still wrong," she said softly. "If Albright didn't know about the Joker cards, and the vicar admits to sending them, who left the very first one?" Tommy frowned. "You mean—" She shook her head. "Perhaps that's a mystery for another morning. For now, let's call it what it is." "A joke repeated?" She smiled faintly. "Exactly. And as Denham once said, the joke's only funny until someone stops laughing." Morning came reluctantly over Sutton Lee, the kind of reluctant dawn that seemed to shiver before showing its face. The fog was lifting, but it left behind a ghostly film on every hedge, every pane, every thought. At the Laurels, a hush lingered over the breakfast table. Tuppence stared into her tea as though reading something hidden in its reflection. Tommy leaned back in his chair, one eye on her and the other on the newspaper he wasn't truly reading. Across the page, a headline declared, "Nettle Hall Raid, Espionage Scandal Linked to Wartime Operation." "Front page fame," he murmured. "You always did have a knack for trouble, old girl." She didn't smile. "It isn't finished." Tommy folded the paper. "I thought Craddock had our villains safely in custody. Miss Albright confessed, the vicar's under guard, and Vale's promising to reform. What's left, short of resurrecting Denham himself?" Tuppence rose, moving to the window. "The laughter," she said softly. "The joke. Something about it keeps circling back like a tune I can't stop humming. It's wrong somehow, twisted in the telling." "You mean Mrs. Calthorpe's joke?" "Yes. She said it so often, didn't she? But each time she told it, she changed a word. Just one. I thought it was her memory, but what if it wasn't?" Tommy frowned. "You think our local gossip did more than gossip?" "I think," said Tuppence, turning, "that she's been playing the greatest joke of all." By noon, Inspector Craddock had established a temporary headquarters in the village hall, an assortment of maps, statements, and a very tired constable with a typewriter. Miss Albright, pale and defeated, sat under guard in the adjoining room. Craddock was rubbing his temples when the door burst open. Tuppence strode in, Tommy behind her, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Beresford," said the inspector wearily, "if you've come to redecorate, I'm afraid the place is booked solid with scandal." "I've come to finish it," said Tuppence, "but you'll need to fetch Mrs. Calthorpe first." "Mrs. Calthorpe?" Craddock blinked. "The village gossip? She's harmless as plum jam." "She's cleverer than jam," said Tuppence crisply, "and stickier." Tommy set the parcel on the table. "She's the one person who's been in every conversation from the start. The fate, Denham's death, the tea at the Laurels, even Nettle Hall by way of her endless stories. She was there when the first joke was told, and she's the only one who laughed." Craddock sighed. "All right, I'll humour you. Though if you're wrong, I'll be needing another pot of coffee and a new inspector." Half an hour later, Mrs. Calthorpe was ushered in. She looked delighted by the attention, cheeks pink, hat tilted just so, her shawl fluttering with righteous curiosity. "My dear inspector," she trilled, "such a fuss for little me. You'll have people talking." "They already are," said Tuppence coolly. "Do sit down, Mrs. Calthorpe." "Oh, how formal we are," she chuckled, taking the chair opposite. "Have you finally solved our little village mystery, or has it solved itself?" "That depends," said Tuppence, "on whether you prefer to laugh first or last." Mrs. Calthorpe blinked, her smile momentarily faltering. "I beg your pardon?" Tuppence leaned forward. "At the fete, you told us about Major Denham's joke, the one about the missing ledger and the dead man smiling. Only when you repeated it later, you changed it. You said, 'the smiling dead man.' Subtle difference, but not meaningless." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I hardly think that—" "Oh, but it matters," said Tuppence, voice light but unyielding. "You see, that version, the smiling dead man, appears nowhere else. Not in Denham's notes, not in Vale's letter, not in Miss Albright's memory. It was your wording, your emphasis." Tommy added quietly, "Almost as if you'd coined it yourself." The room grew still. Outside, a clock struck 1, each chime echoing like a heartbeat. Mrs. Calthorpe gave a small, nervous laugh. What nonsense! I only repeated what I heard. From whom? Asked Tuppence. Why, from everyone, I suppose. No, said Tuppence softly. You told the joke first. Craddock's brows rose. Is that true, Mrs. Calthorpe? I might have. Oh, what does it matter? It was just a silly thing. Not so silly, Tuppence murmured, because that phrase, your phrase, turned out to be a password, a key to a code Denham left behind. Only someone who knew its meaning could have repeated it precisely. Mrs. Calthorpe's face changed then, subtly but unmistakably. The plump geniality drained away, leaving something cold and sharp in its place. Well, she said softly, I suppose the game had to end eventually. Craddock straightened. Then you admit? Oh, don't look so shocked, Inspector, she said. I'm not the first widow to tidy up her husband's affairs. Tuppence's eyes flashed. Your husband? The accomplice Denham and Albright killed in France. Mrs. Calthorpe smiled thinly. Not killed, Mrs. Beresford. Buried alive, in shame. They used him, then discarded him when the tide turned, called him a traitor to keep themselves safe. And I became the merry widow, didn't I? The gossip, the joke-teller, the harmless fool. What better disguise for revenge? Tommy whistled softly. You played your part beautifully. She gave him a small, proud nod. Thank you. I even let Denham live long enough to sweat. He thought himself clever, burning half that ledger. But he'd already sent me the other half, by mistake. Imagine his face when he realized. And the joker cards? Asked Tuppence. Mrs. Calthorpe's eyes gleamed. A little whimsy. He once said laughter was the last refuge of the guilty. I gave him his laughter back, one card at a time. The fool's grin to mock his conscience. Craddock's tone hardened. You manipulated Albright into believing she was responsible. She was responsible, Mrs. Calthorpe snapped. They both were, but she needed only a nudge, a whispered reminder of an old phrase, a suggestion that the past wasn't as buried as she thought. Fear does the rest. And Vale, he was the perfect fool to echo it aloud. You enjoyed it, Tuppence said quietly. Mrs. Calthorpe looked away. Enjoyed it? No, I savoured it. Craddock stepped forward, voice steady. And the ledger, where is it? She hesitated, then smiled again. That same bright, empty smile that had fooled a village for years. Gone, burned, like their lies. Tuppence's voice was calm, almost gentle. Not quite. From the parcel on the table she drew a small, worn book bound in red leather, the Merry Compendium of English Wit. Mrs. Calthorpe's gaze froze. You left it behind at the Laurels, Tuppence said softly. You said it was an heirloom, your late husband's favourite. You even joked it contained all his wisdom. I took a look inside. She opened the book. The hollow interior had been carved with care, lined with faded cloth. Inside, nestled neatly, were a series of folded, smoke-stained pages, the missing half of Denham's ledger. Craddock let out a slow breath. Well, I'll be... Mrs. Calthorpe's hand shot out, lightning fast, but Craddock was faster. He caught her wrist mid-lunge. The mask cracked entirely then, the genteel laughter giving way to a snarl. Years, she hissed, years of being their fool. Do you know what it's like, Mrs. Beresford, to hear them laugh, to see them sip their tea and call it justice? He trusted them, and they left him to rot while they polished their medals. Tuppence met her gaze steadily. And so you became what they made of him, another ghost with a smile that wasn't real. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Mrs. Calthorpe sagged back in her chair, all fury spent. Perhaps, she murmured, but it's a fine thing, Mrs. Beresford, to be the one laughing last. Tuppence closed the book carefully. The joke's over, Mrs. Calthorpe, and no one's laughing any more. Craddock nodded to the constable. Take her. As she was led away, the older woman's head remained high, but as the door closed behind her, a curious sound escaped her. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, somewhere between the two. Later that evening, the Beresfords sat before the fire at the Laurels. The red book lay on the table between them, its empty hollow now just that, empty. Tommy poured a measure of brandy. Well, he said, it's not every day one solves a murder, unmasks a spy, and unearths a post-war scandal before luncheon. Tuppence smiled faintly. And all because of a joke. He raised an eyebrow. You've a knack for finding tragedy in the absurd, dear heart. Perhaps that's where tragedy hides best, she said softly. Behind laughter, behind the ordinary, behind the smile. Craddock appeared at the door, hat in hand, a rare smile tugging at his lips. All tied up, Mrs. Beresford. She's confessed in full. The ministry will see to the rest. You've done a fine job, both of you. Tuppence looked toward the fire. I wonder, she said quietly, how many more jokes are waiting to be retold before someone notices the truth behind them? Tommy lifted his glass. Then here's to noticing, my clever girl. They clinked glasses. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, cleansing, steady. The village lights flickered faintly through the mist, ordinary and safe once more. Tuppence leaned her head against Tommy's shoulder. Do you think, she asked drowsily, people ever stop laughing at their own misfortunes? He smiled, pressing her hand. Not while they've someone to share the punchline. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and somewhere far off the echo of laughter drifted on the wind, soft, distant, but no longer mocking. Only human. It was a fine, pale morning in Sutton Lee, the sort that smudged away the last traces of storm and scandal. The village wore its calm like fresh linen, crisp, spotless, and pretending it had never seen a wrinkle. The papers had already moved on from the Nettle affair, and the Beresfords for the first time in weeks had nothing pressing to investigate, except, perhaps, what Albert might be burning for tea. Tuppence sat in her favourite armchair near the window, the sun falling softly on her notebook and the cooling teapot beside it. Outside, a milk cart rattled past and a robin scolded the cat from a rosebush. Tommy, meanwhile, had declared the morning sacred to idleness. He sat by the hearth in shirt-sleeves, reading the Times as though world peace depended on his commentary. Craddock's report came out this morning, he said without looking up. They've officially tied up the case. Albright's confession stands, Calthorpe's to be tried, and the ministry's keeping Project Nettle under lock and key until the end of time. Tuppence didn't answer immediately. She was watching the steam curl from her teacup as though divining shapes in it. And yet, she said finally, there's something about that case that refuses to stay buried, like laughter caught in the air. Tommy lowered the paper just enough to see her expression. You've been brooding ever since Craddock left. Don't tell me you're planning a sequel. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that jokes are rarely harmless. They begin as play, a little twist of words, a glimmer of mischief, but they always reveal something the teller never means to share. He folded the paper neatly and leaned back. That's a rather grim philosophy for a woman who insists on making me laugh at breakfast. Ah, but that's the point, said Tuppence, smiling faintly. The line between laughter and truth is perilously thin. Mrs. Calthorpe's little joke was her revenge in miniature. Each retelling was a rehearsal for the real thing, the punchline delivered in blood rather than wit. Tommy winced theatrically. You do have a knack for turning tea into tragedy. It's only perspective, she replied. Humour and horror are neighbours in the human heart. One treads lightly, the other slips through when the door is ajar. Tommy regarded her for a moment, then smiled. You sound like the vicar. He'd be flattered, she said dryly, but even he never thought to weaponize a smile. The clock struck 4. Outside, the world glowed in the soft amber of late afternoon. Albert had lit the lamps and opened the windows to let in the scent of wet garden earth. The storm had scrubbed the roses into renewed life. Craddock arrived not long after, looking almost civilized without his overcoat and mud. Fritz ushered him in with a sort of politeness that suggested tolerance rather than welcome. I won't stay long, said the inspector, accepting a cup of tea with a nod of thanks. I've just come from town. They've moved Mrs. Calthorpe to a sanatorium. Quiet place. Walls thick enough to drown out her laughter, I dare say. Do you think she's mad? Asked Tuppence softly. Craddock hesitated. Mad enough to believe the world owed her the truth, and sane enough to make sure she got it her way. She wasn't the first to mistake vengeance for justice, Mrs. Beresford, and she won't be the last. Tommy offered him a plate of scones. And Miss Albright? Released, said Craddock. Poor woman's lost her footing in every sense. She's gone to stay with relatives in Kent. As for Vale, he's volunteering with veterans now. Some souls do mend, given time. Tuppence nodded slowly. And the ledger? In the hands of the ministry, Craddock replied. which means it'll be buried deeper than the crown jewels. Between us, I'd wager the officials are already pretending it never existed. Tommy chuckled. Then justice for once gets filed under miscellaneous. Craddock smiled wryly. You'd be surprised how often it does. There was a companionable pause. The fire hummed softly, and the wind rustled faintly against the glass, the sort of domestic quiet that only comes after chaos. Finally, the inspector rose, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. Well, I'll leave you two geniuses to your peace. Heaven knows you've earned it. Tuppence's eyes sparkled. Inspector, I do believe that's the first compliment you've given us without grimacing. He chuckled. Don't push your luck. Then, with mock solemnity, only you two could solve a murder by listening to a joke. Tommy raised his cup. And may we never have to solve another over tea. Craddock grinned, tipping his hat as he departed. The front door clicked shut behind him, and the sound faded into the evening hush. When they were alone again, Tuppence stretched lazily in her chair, watching the dying light. Strange, isn't it? She mused. How quickly life slips back into normality. One moment it's secrets, telegrams and gunfire. The next, it's cream and sugar. Tommy yawned. Normality is vastly underrated, if you ask me. I prefer my mysteries without punchlines. Tuppence laughed. And yet, you'd be bored without them. True, he admitted, smiling, but just once I'd like to go a full fortnight without nearly being shot in an abandoned manor. That's what you said after the affair at Greyfriars Park, she reminded him, and after the missing diamond in Devon. Yes, but this time I mean it, said Tommy solemnly. She laughed again, soft, genuine, unburdened. My dear Tommy, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that our lives are allergic to boredom. He set his cup down and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Then may they never recover. Outside, the village began its slow transformation into evening. Lamps blinked on one by one along the lane, their reflections trembling in the puddles. A group of children, released from homework, ran laughing past the garden gate. Somewhere down the road, the church bell chimed 6. Tuppence rose, drawing the curtains. It feels quieter than it used to, she said. Tommy came to stand beside her. Not quieter, he said softly. Just content. They stood there together, watching the dusk gather. The fire crackled behind them, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. After a while, Tuppence spoke again. Do you think, Tommy, that laughter can ever be completely innocent? He thought about it. I think laughter's like light, he said. It shows what's there and what isn't. Depends who's holding the lantern. She smiled faintly. And if the lantern-bearer is a fool? Then, he said, at least he's a cheerful one. Later that night, when the lamps were dimmed and the village had folded itself into sleep, a soft wind stirred the ivy along the walls of the laurels. It carried the faint sound of laughter, not eerie this time, not haunted, just human. The kind that rises at the end of a long story, when the danger's past and the fire's low. Inside, the Beresfords' voices drifted through the quiet. You know, Tuppence, said Tommy drowsily, if we ever retire again, let's choose a hobby that doesn't involve corpses. She chuckled. Bridge, perhaps? Too risky. Gardening? Deadly. Tuppence laughed, the sound warm and alive. Then we'll just keep solving mysteries. Safest choice of all. Spoken like a woman who never learned self-preservation, he murmured, and married a man who never learned to refuse me. Their laughter mingled, soft, familiar, comforting, and the wind carried it out across Sutton Lee, past the hedgerows and into the fading night. No malice in it now, no secret mockery, only the laughter of two people who had seen darkness and chosen stubbornly to find light.